So I'm very happy to be opening this last day of this really rich, diverse, and thought-provoking, and even maybe slightly optimistic conference, which we all need so much. With this, what seems to be this really great panel entitled, I'm sorry, I forgot, Politics in the As If. Yeah, of course. Okay, so we'll start with Qian, her paper called Notes Towards a Performative Theory of National Identity. She's a recent graduate at the National University of Singapore and Australian National University, and is set to pursue a postgraduate degree researching political theory, either in National University of Singapore or the University of Oxford. Is it known yet, or it's still in the air? Never mind. We'll wish you the best anyway, and go ahead and please give us your paper.
Hi, I'm Qian. Yes, it's been decided. I'm in NUS now, and so what I hope to do. Sorry, can I check how much time I have? About 10 minutes.
You actually have 20 minutes for your presentation. We'll do the papers one after the other, and then the time remaining, we'll discuss them all together.
Okay, thanks. So, so today I'll be sharing my paper about I think of it more as a bunch of notes towards a performative theory of national identity. So what I try to do is I try to answer the question of how we should understand national identity, and I do that by putting Judith Butler in conversation with a long history of thinkers of nationalism, and I want to try and elucidate a trend towards acknowledging the constructivist nature of national identity. So eventually, my analysis will kind of point towards a global justice beyond the paradigm of nation states, even though they will probably still stick around. So I'll start with some thoughts on why we should understand national identity. So even though at least in the academic world, there are many scholars who have now long refuted ethno-cultural assumptions of national identity, the tendency to evoke xenophobic ethno-national and ethno-cultural basis of national identity remains unfazed and has picked up. So here I refer to how, for example, the pandemic has made apparent the xenophobic tendencies of nation states. There was that recent, racism towards Asian Americans in America, and even here closer to home in Singapore where I am, there has been a lot of rethinking about the way we treat migrant workers in Singapore and Malaysia. And so one important thing, or one concrete implication of how we understand national identity is that outsiders, those who do not share our national identity, are deemed unentitled to a nation's resources and even attention. And so in times of crises like the pandemic, the fault lines that national identity tend to reflect become even more acute. And so I want to dive into Benedict Anderson's definition of a nation. So Ben Anderson has elucidated how, or maybe has kind of predicted and drawn attention to this ability of conceptions of the nation to spur a lot of violence and a lot of self-sacrifice. So it is, and he has also, I think, in many ways been one of the first to talk about how national identity is something that is socially constructed, yet extremely powerful. So yeah, I think being able to understand more clearly how national identity is socially constructed will allow us to be able to understand the patterns of violence a little more clearly. So yeah, going back to Anderson, I will look at a sample of these socially constructed theories of national identity. Um, so yeah, and I do think that a lot of it can be traced to Anderson amongst other thinkers, especially his definition of how the nation can be understood or defined as an imagined political community, both imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. So crucial to the political imagination of a nation is that there are other nation states that exist alongside it, but that the nation state is still distinctive and it's sovereign. Yeah, so that is the map that I will bring forward. And so here's my thesis. So I want to argue that 4 characteristics of national identity are revealed on top of current understandings of national identity as being socially constructed. So when we understand national identity as performative on top of just being socially constructed, we can see that it operates on punitive exclusion, that it is a mediated product of acts and national discourse. It's open to proliferating possibilities, and it's undergirded by fictions of essentializing nationalist discourses. So yeah, I do want to also underscore that a lot of the arguments that I'm making draw on, or I like to see it as continuous with a lot of the scholarship that's already been done. So for example, the third characteristic, or even the first 3 really, they kind of amplify critiques of commonly assumed ethno-cultural and geolegal foundations of national identity. But what I think, for example, Butler brings to the table is that it reveals how these assumptions are metaphysically untenable and not just bad in the ethical sense. So I'll go through a review of theories of, or try to elucidate what I see as a trend in theories of nationalism. I'll start with the mainstream conception of national identity, and I borrow Habermas's definition, which I don't want to single him out for the sake of him being Habermas, but I think this definition is pretty neat and encapsulates what I think the mainstream conception roughly is. So he roughly defines national identity as a sense of the importance of common history, language, and culture that enables citizens to see themselves as parts of the same whole. So there are 4 aspects to this definition that I want to spend a bit or elucidate. So when he talks about a whole, he refers to a nation state. And national identity is likened to the patriotic glue that binds citizens to the nation state. And there exists some kind of ethno-cultural foundation which all citizens, and ideally only citizens, are privy to. And this is one notion that scholars like Anthony Smith has already, they've heavily criticized. Another aspect of this definition is the specification of citizens, which denotes some legal prerequisites. Usually these are geolegal foundations of national identity. For example, you have to, some countries would mandate that you have to be born within the territory to be conferred citizenship. So another aspect of this, I guess, history of theories of nationalism is a nation-state dichotomy. So Ernest Renan has quite famously figured the nation as the sole and spiritual principle to the territorial and legal demarcation that is a state. Ernest Gellner talks about how the state is a precondition of the nation's emergence, even if it's not, even if the state alone is not the sole condition of a nation's emergence. Yeah, that is, I guess, my overview or oversimplification of a lot of the mainstream theories of nationalism. And I think if we harp on the nation-state dichotomy a little bit more, that is where the room for a lot of constructivist theories of nationalism can begin, or where they start taking foot. So, for example, I think, so I'll be focusing on Pincha's notion or theory of spectral nationality, and Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism. And I think, at least for Pincha, he really plays on the nation-state dichotomy a lot more. So he refines this dichotomous distinction, proposing that nation and state exist in a spectral relation. So his writing is really complex, but from what I understand, or at least the big message that I think is relevant to what the argument I'm trying to make here is that the nation and state are mutually constitutive. Even as we like to imagine that they are distinct, we can't really deny that the state exists as the trace of the inhuman and unnatural spectral other within the nation. And so simply put, is that the state, through various institutions and practices, creates the nation. And so, but also conversely, then the nation is constantly haunted by the state. Yeah, so we can think of one function of the nation state, and I put a hyphen in between the two, because I think that is still a whole notion that or a whole debate that is important, but also aside from what I'm trying to talk about here about national identity. So we can think of one function of the nation state as precisely the cultivation of a national identity. Now move on to Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism. Oops, I think I missed out something in my slide. I'm so sorry. But so here in gray, I think if I were to summarize Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism, it's that nationalism is constructed and maintained by both grand gestures as well as quotidian symbols, routines, and essentializing rhetoric. And so I apologize for the graphic design here, but I tried to draw emphasis on how Billig, I think, really foregrounds the role of the mundane gestures in producing and maintaining national identity. So two takeaways from Billig's ideas is that one, nationalism is embedded in habits of thought and life. And second is the self-constitution of a nation's identity through essentializing rhetoric. Yeah, and so like I think what is important about this first characteristic of being embedded in the quotidian and repetitive is that we tend to forget it. And so it is important to pay attention to that while when we study how national identity is constructed. And so the second tenet that builds on the first is that this constitutive rhetoric is both essentializing of the self and other, and indicative of a nation's self-understanding as existing among other nations. So here I think there's a lot of, some direct intellectual lineage from Anderson's dictum of the nation as an imagined community. Because all members of the sovereign community create images of communion in their psyche. But also, Billig argues that since our nation, an imagined community with an imagined territory, is always conceived of as a nation among other nations, the other is endemic to us. So if I were to bring maybe Pincha and Billig forward and to read them alongside each other, it is that so the role of, I want to underscore as I go along the role of the state in constituting the quotidian and essentializing speech acts that is not really just contained within the nation part of the equation, and also the context of the nation state's imagination of itself existing in a world of nations. And so the, I guess, genealogy that I'm trying to paint here is that we can imagine Judith Butler as coming after the contribution or building on to the contributions of Benedict and Peng-Chia. So I'll be drawing on Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. These three characteristics that I want to talk about, they mainly come from her 1990 book, Gender Trouble. I understand that she's made a bit of tweaks along the way later, but for the sake of argumentation, I mainly drew from that book. And so the three characteristics that I would underscore, and I'll be giving a really brief summary because I assume that I'm talking to a pretty specialized audience who are interested in this kind of prefigurative discussions and theorizing. But the three characteristics of performativity that I think would be relevant to my argumentation is that the first is how Butler's gender performativity it performs a critical role in the sense that its negative formulation is basically that it criticizes foundationalist conceptions of gender. And then the second is that gender performativity brings out the affective nature of how we think of gender through the mechanism of abjection. For example, that we think of abjection can be summarized, I guess, as expulsion followed by repulsion, where that which is expelled, only becomes not me in its act of being expelled, and it becomes repulsive also because it constantly threatens to subvert the differentiation of inner and outer. So how this mechanism of abjection directly bears or contributes to this discussion on national identity is how in their proximity, foreigners threaten to cheaply enter and share in our self-understanding. Foreigners desanctify the always and already permeable border that demarcates and constitutes our national self-understanding. And so, in a way, because they are constantly threatening to subvert this border, it forces us to confront the fragile fiction of our national identity, and also threatens the privilege of, for example, citizens' access to resources. And so the foreigner, especially, for example, migrant workers in Singapore, you could think of how they are constantly, the boundaries between us and not us is constantly being drawn and redrawn to protect the permeable boundedness of national identity. This also can be directly linked to Benedict's argument that a nation's self-understanding is also constructed through stereotypes of self and other, and these stereotypes are founded on differences, and also has direct bearing on Peng-Chia's conception of how national self-understanding is absolutely contingent on the constant abjection of the foreigner, so that we can have a notion of national identity that persists through time. And then the third characteristic of gender performativity that is relevant is that it is also, apart from being a critique, it is also a positive reconstruction of gender as sedimented through essentializing discourse and repeated stylized acts that are necessarily open to futurity and alterity. So if we directly apply this characteristic, we can understand national identity as a product of mediation between acts and national discourses. So if we bring back Benedict's language, we can understand national identity more accurately as a mediated product between essentializing stereotypes and routinized quotidian imperfect acts, and also that these discourses they play inadvertently two roles. One is that they regulate, and the second is that they generate that which they seek to regulate. And so then, because the imperfect imitations, they necessarily parody and displace the myth of gender. So that, I mean, going back to Butler and how she conceptualizes gender. So the other characteristic of national identity that can be brought out is the proliferating possibilities of national identity in where daily mundane acts are all they all sediment through time to at once affirm the fiction of stereotypes, but also to form the substance of that which is national identity. And I think here is also where Ping-Chia and Michael Billig's theories come, I guess, to the limits of their theories. Yeah, like, because I realize I am running out of time, but
you have like a couple more minutes, if
okay.
possible. Wrap it up in minutes. It will be perfect.
I will go to the fourth characteristic and then yeah, the last idea that I want to talk about is the problematize is that if we understand national identity as performative, then it is more effective in problematizing ethno-cultural foundations as well as geolegal foundations in national identity. And here is also where I go a little bit beyond Butler, because where, for example, abjection is effective in highlighting the us versus other distinction, but in the context of nation states, it is not just us versus other, but many other others. And so if we consider, for example, just the individual foreigner, is not, the dichotomy is fundamentally us versus not us, where the not us is often, but not always, an other belonging elsewhere. So for example, the tourist is the not us that belongs elsewhere, but the stateless, they are a not us that are not an other as well. So doubly repulsed and expelled, they exist liminally within the geographical territory of us. Yet they are then, and apart from the stateless, there can also be a not us who experience self-abjection. For example, the alienated citizen or the economic migrant who chooses to leave or has not left. Yeah, if national identity is performative, there can be an us who turn against ourselves. And if abjection is expulsion and repulsion, the us who come to be repulsed by ourselves but are unable to expel the nation state, expel themselves instead. And so they become the abject, not us. And so if I were to wrap up, sorry, with some thoughts on what bringing Butler in conversation or applying Butler's ideas of performativity to this discussion on national identity underscore is that we do have to think about the ethics of how we treat those that are doubly repulsed and those that repulse themselves. I do think that this conclusion is something that's not really new, but it just adds further urgency to why we should think about how we talk about national identity and its very strained relation to citizenship. And like, I think there are a lot more categories in between that we do have to conceptualize and draw the ethical implications of. Yes, so sorry for taking up extra time, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this really nice presentation. So we're now moving on to our second presenter, and then we'll have the discussion following all three presentations. So our next paper is Constituent Power as Prefigurative, who is Maxim van Asseldonk, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, paper. Maxim is a Marie Curie-funded PhD candidate in political philosophy at the Center for Citizenship, Civil Society, and the Rule of Law at the University of Aberdeen. His key research interests are radical democracy, constituent power, civil disobedience, which is a nice combination, and political community. Recent publications of his have appeared in Constellations and Philosophy and Social Criticism, which are two of my favorites. So let's go.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying that this is very much work in progress. So I do really appreciate any feedback that might come up in the Q&A later. And also, I think I'm in the slightly more comfortable position of giving this talk towards the end of what's already been a very diverse and interesting conference, giving me the opportunity to relate to some of the talks we've seen over the past couple of days. We've seen a lot of different talks, both conceptually and empirically, discussing specific social movements or social movements in general. So I think that what I'm going to do today is a little bit different. So coming from a philosophical perspective, what I'm trying to do really is to look at prefigurative politics and kind of abstract from that a model of politics, of political action, and see how that might be useful for a theory of constituent power. So with that in mind, let's get straight in. So while the concepts of constituent power and prefigurative politics at first glimpse seem to share a number of normative affinities, their divergences on some key points may seem insurmountable. So the concepts come together in their joint affirmation of the democratic value of unauthorized political action. However, both in the way such action is carried out and in the internal composition of the collectives of agents acting in such ways, significant differences seem to arise. So traditionally conceived, the people to whose constituent power the concept refers is conceived of as a unified whole. So this is the case, for example, in CS, widely credited with first coining the term. But this tendency is evident even more strongly in the work of Carl Schmitt, who conceives of the people as displaying a substantial unity after having eradicated internal differences. Moreover, in most accounts of constituent power, the aim is a more or less rigid institutionalization of the people's demands. Now, in marked contrast, many contemporary studies of prefigurative politics, whether conceptual or empirical, emphasize its essential character, lack of internal unity, and often its horizontal future. So put briefly, the overarching view appears to be that unlike constituent power, prefigurative politics operates neither with an idea of a unified people, nor with a necessarily determined end goal in sight. So in this talk, I want to engage with these apparent differences and argue that they can be seen in mutually reinforcing ways. So specifically, the concept of constituent power faces a major problem which might threaten its supposed democratic value, the lure of totalitarianism. So I've argued elsewhere that the specific element of traditional theories of constituent power leading to this problem is a certain way of ontologizing the concept of the people. So I'm going to begin the talk by briefly restating my argument there, and that's going to be very brief and just a very short summary. But that's going to lead to the conclusion that the people does not exist. However, accepting that the concept of the people remains a crucial point of reference for constituent power, I'll then move on to outline what I think is going to be the main contention of this paper, which suggests conceptualizing the people as prefigurative. So where does this ontologization of the people come from? Now, for reasons of time, I'm going to just focus on Schmitt here and just give a very brief summary. But Schmitt puts a lot of emphasis on the unity of the people, theorizing the people as a unified whole displaying what he calls substantial homogeneity. Furthermore, Schmitt presupposes the existence of the people as an ontologically given unity. Now, Schmitt's argument in his constitutional theory is intimately intertwined with his argument in political theology. So in the latter, Schmitt famously claims that all concepts of modern state law are in fact secularized theological concepts. As Hans Lindahl shows, this thesis allows Schmitt to secularize the function of God in this traditional theological schema and transpose it onto the people. This means that Schmitt comes to view the existence of the people as an ontological given, which is prior to the political and exists necessarily, whereas its constitution is rendered radically contingent. So this is analogous to the relation between God and the world in the theological schema. Now, this presupposition in Schmitt may seem surprising, but there are two main reasons why not presupposing the existence of the people as ontologically necessary would render Schmitt's constitutional theory incoherent. First, Schmitt would lose his reasons to insist on the absolute sovereignty of the people. And second, Schmitt in general tends to collapse normative questions into existential ones, writing that, quote, what exists as political power has value because it exists, end of quote. So if he does not presuppose the existence of the people, no construction thereof by these commitments could have normative standing. So while the question of whether in the original theological schema God exists necessarily is beside the point here, Schmidt doesn't really offer any arguments as to why we should follow him in transposing this relation onto the people. So Schmidt, in short, seems unable to demonstrate that the people, as he conceives it, exists in the first place. So if he fails to demonstrate that, the question is, of course, could he have done so? So I want to kind of drive the point home here by following Derrida's reading of Schmitt in The Politics of Friendship and suggest that he could not. Now, the key point there is that Derrida argues that the ultimate friend is she who may one day become my enemy. Friendship in this friend-enemy distinction cannot be a given, for that would undermine the possibility of agency and reduce every part to a static being neither required nor able to interact with other beings. So there's a sort of contamination ongoing here because the two concepts mutually influence each other, which is the case both conceptually and practically. And this means, as mentioned before, that the actual friend may always become a future enemy and vice versa. Now, this may seem like a daunting prospect, if not a bleak worldview, but for Derrida, this feature actually forms a condition of possibility for free action. To fix the terms of friendship and enmity is to predetermine the modes of relationality. Instead, Derrida suggests such relationalities are better seen as ongoing processes of association and dissociation, whose terms are by definition continuously in flux. Now, why does this very brief outline matter for a theory of constituent power? So if modes of association and relationality and friendship and enmity cannot be fixed, whether in advance or at present, this is because they have no ontological reference. So I'd like to suggest that the same is true for the concept of the people. So to put it briefly and perhaps provocatively, the people does not exist. Now, of course, this raises a serious challenge to any notion of constituent power. So if constituent power locates the source of constitutional and institutional authority in the people, it needs some notion of the people to correspond with it. And if the people does not exist, what would remain of its constituent power? So that's where I want to suggest that the concept of prefigurative politics may prove decisive. So before continuing along that route, of course, one might wonder whether it's still viable to even speak of the people in the context of constituent power at all. And indeed, it's true that some authors, for various reasons, propose rejecting either the concept of the people or that of constituent power altogether. So Negri, for one, rejects the people as being at the basis of constituent power. For reasons of time, I'm kind of oversimplifying his argument here a little bit. But he holds that for the people to be the subject of constituent power, it must first be defined. And defining the people, he thinks, requires law. So accordingly, the people has inadvertently become subordinate to the law it was supposed to authorize. Now, from quite a different perspective, David Deisenhouse maintains that the people could only be defined in juridical terms, but he suggests that this simply renders the concept of constituent power either unnecessary or incoherent. Now, both these arguments only work insofar as it is indeed presupposed that the concept of the people can only refer to an institutionally circumscribed entity which is given real existence by said legal circumscription. But this need not be so. So if we follow Derrida, we seem to have a paradox here. So the source of constitutional authority in this model is the people, but said people seems to only be brought into existence by that very constitution. And even then, this existence remains an uncertain and provisional one. So both of the authors briefly just mentioned seek to try and resolve this paradox by crossing out one of its terms. So instead, I'd like to suggest following Derrida and embrace the paradox and see it as constitutive of democratic politics. So before continuing along that path, I want to just briefly note that conceptually, prefigurative politics is typically understood to encompass at least two elements. So obviously, the field is wide and diverse, and there's a lot of disagreement on what exactly the concept should involve. But I think two elements that are generally agreed upon is that first, it removes a temporal barrier between present and future by acting as if the future is already present. Second, it effaces the distinction between means and ends. Now, these are interrelated in that the blurring of the temporal barrier means that a vision of a future society is enacted in the present, whereas problematizing the means-ends distinction suggests that the ways of acting and relating envisioned for that future society should be reflected in the actions and relations of those striving for it in the here and now. Now, how can this be brought to bear on the paradox that emerges from the preceding discussion? So, as Derrida articulates the paradox, the question is whether the we, the people, which famously opens the Declaration of Independence, is a constitutive statement reporting on a matter of fact, or whether this statement itself produces its own truth, bringing the people of which it speaks into existence. Now, Derrida continues, this question is necessarily an undecidable one. So when talking about undecidability, which he does most elaborately in his discussion of justice in his 1992 essay, Force of Law, Derrida rejects both the position that what is just is a matter of mere convention and the idea that justice permits an ultimate truth. So by extension, who can be identified as the people can be captured neither by convention nor by some naturalized given. Now, such a declaration of we, the people, quote, makes right, founds right, or the law, and gives rights, end of quote. Hence, the paradoxical nature, for it does so on behalf of an entity that does not exist. Moreover, it does so by virtue of claiming a right which is first instituted in the very act which it claims to have a right to. Accordingly, at least in a legal sense, prior to such a declaration, the people neither existed nor had any right to declare anything. Moreover, any juridical declaration does not make the people come into existence as much more than a juridical fiction. So this means that the present paradox is both constitutive and perpetual. The people's and its declarations' undecidability mean that one can never know the right answer because there is no right answer. So this is where the contours of a prefigurative reading of constituent power begin to enter the scene. So I'd like to suggest seeing constituent power in this context, in the first instance, as an articulation, as raising a dual claim. So one side of that claim involves some content, for example, a reference to a specific set of laws, moral principles, values underpinning those, and so on. The precise character of which is not very important here. The second, whether it is done so explicitly or not, involves a specific claim of we, the people. Now, this may be explicit, but this may also be implicit in that it claims to have such a democratic right to make such a claim. The point is that this claim is never in full accordance with any being that is the people, for no such being exists. So my contention would be that raising this claim is best seen in prefigurative terms. Now, recall that the main two agreed upon features of prefiguration are the blurring of the distinctions between respectively means and ends and present and future. Accordingly, to claim in the present that some we are the people is to prefigure that we being the people to the full extent possible. So this suggests that any such claim will be defeasible. So rather than consisting in closure and exclusion, as we saw in Schmidt, raising such a claim, which really amounts to invoking the name of the people, encompasses an opening up which invites its own renegotiation, contestation, verification, or rejection. But the claim itself blurs the distinction between present and future, for if it's claimed people already in the present as a full existing being, its name would neither need to be invoked nor be open to further contestation and renegotiation. So we can clearly see this blurred temporal distinction to briefly look back in Derrida's discussion of declarations of independence. When drafting the declaration, the we, the people, was at once a reference to a not yet existing entity and an enactment of the right of that entity as if it already existed in the present. So the fact that such a claim could in principle be made by any agent is important for two main reasons. First, it attests to the undecidable character of the people. So if the people were to be decided in advance, the range of agents who could raise such a claim would accordingly be limited by that very circumscription. So formulated with Lefort, the people in this interpretation is indeterminable. And this indeterminability is necessary due to the absence of any steady ontological footing on whose basis any circumscription of the people could be based. It is also democratically necessary to preserve this characteristic openness at its basis. Secondly, the fact that these claims can be made by any agent is important because it links this interpretation of constituent power back to prefigurative politics. And I want to suggest that it does so in two ways. So first, it attests to the blurring of the means-ends distinction. The aforementioned indeterminacy is a constitutive feature of democracy, as is its openness to renewed claims and renegotiations. It cannot be the case that the range of agents who could possibly raise such a constituent claim is determined in advance. Moreover, if the end is to have the people rule, the claim to have the right to rule as the people is the means with which that end is sought to be attained. And second, and relatedly, the fact that any agent, regardless of prior authorization, can make such a claim is linked to the removal of the barrier between present and future. If a claimed right to make any such claim is prefigured, its present authorization becomes simply irrelevant. So where does that leave us? So conceptualizing the peoplehood associated with constituent power as a prefigurative claim constructs the following picture. A claim is raised to the effect that some collective agent is the people, but the is in this conjunction is to be interpreted as the invocation of a name rather than the embodiment of a more or less pre-existent being. Accordingly, this claim serves as the beginning, not ending, of a chain of verifications, rejections, contestations, and renegotiations. However, because of the political action involved in any claim being raised in this way, those claiming that we, the people, already act as if their claim had been verified, even if it has not been. And that's a crucial point. The claim is unverifiable and undecidable because there is no people, only contesting claims to that effect. So against this backdrop, I'd like to raise three further considerations about prefigurative politics specifically. So first, we might want to reconsider how exactly the means-ends distinction is blurred. So I'd like to suggest that the type of blurring, the type of prefiguration important to constituent power conceived in this way should be seen in terms of what Dan Swain calls ends effacing politics. So in short, that means that while multiple visions of the future are being prefigured, the future constellation of social relations that is aimed at is never conceived of as an ultimate and unchangeable end. If what's being prefigured in the present account is the people, having a predetermined notion of the precise circumscription of that people takes us right back to square one. Second, relatedly, Yuri Gordon rejects the idea of prefiguration being characterized by what he calls a unified promise, which he associates with a fixed utopian future. However, I would like to suggest instead envisaging the promise at the heart of prefigurative politics and constituent power in terms of Derrida's notion of a democracy to come, which he calls, quote, a democracy that has the structure of a promise. Now, the key thing about this promise is that it's one that's never to be fulfilled, because to fulfill a promise in this sense would be to claim to know a definitive endpoint of the structure of social relations. And this again would at that point rule out free association. So there's a promise, yes, but a perpetual one. So the third and final point I'd like to make regarding prefiguration relates less clearly to the above two, but I think in this context is nonetheless crucial. So scholars both of constituent power and of prefiguration disagree over the question of institutionalization. However, I do believe that it's impossible to fully detach at least constituent power, and perhaps indeed politics more generally, from some form of institutionality. In fact, I think that we should think of both constituent power and prefigurative politics as tending to a certain degree of institutionalization, if only so as to imbue their efforts with a degree of permanence. Absent the prospects of attaining some degree of permanence, no political action will serve a clear purpose. Moreover, it's also important to bear in mind that institutions need not be as rigid and static as they're sometimes portrayed. So, for example, Davina Cooper highlights the prefigurative way in which some institutions and institutional actors may act. So in conclusion, I've advocated understanding the peoplehood associated with constituent power as prefigurative, seeing it not as a being, but as a kind of political action and certain social relations. This, I have suggested, helps alleviate the main worry animating critics of constituent power. So the people is not unified and pre-existing, but dissensual, diverse, and more or less active. So constituent power conceived in this way involves a promise, but this promise, as mentioned, only safeguards its future-oriented character, so it's not a teleology, but rather a horizon. If the promise had a determinate endpoint, it can no longer be a promise, for this would require determining at that point how social relations would be structured. To fix this state of affair would again require some sort of ontologization, which would again take us right back to square one. So a promise, yes, but one never to be fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're now, wow, and thank you so much for sticking to your times. Moving on to the last but not least speaker of this lovely panel, Michael Zangerl, sorry, who will be speaking about decentral prefiguration, Jacques Rancière, and the various politics of the as-if. Michael is a graduate student of philosophy at the University of Vienna. He's currently writing a master's thesis on, he has recently completed, and congratulations on that, his master's thesis on Jacques Rancière, reading of Hegel. And he also contributed to a forthcoming anthology edited by Georg Stenger and Inga Rommel, entitled, I'm sorry, my German pronunciation is
Faktum, Faktizität.
Faktum, Faktizität, Wirklichkeit, phenomenologische Perspektiven. Yeah, that's pretty much, okay, great. So go ahead.
Thank you for this nice introduction. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So my presentation is informed by various remarks that Jacques Rancière's writings in politics provide a productive point of friction for thinking prefigurative politics. For instance, our very own Dan has remarked something similar, or Anat's presentation on Friday was very much informed by that. Nevertheless, a systematic reconstruction of Rancière conceptualizations of acting as if is still pending. I consider this detrimental, as Rancière, I will argue, offers different accounts of the political dimension of counterfactual modes of acting. So I would like to avoid homogenizing heterogeneous views. And in order to do that, I will sketch two strands of arguments. On the one hand, I want to argue that Rancière has continuously paid attention to the modes of acting as if. From his 1981 dissertation on 19th century workers to his more recent examinations of the occupations of public squares and parks, which we have already heard a lot about in this conference. Rancière's oeuvre is informed by a sentiment that egality can only be realized by non-utopian, non-strategic modes of acting counterfactually. On the other hand, it seems to me that in Rancière we find significant differences regarding the concepts involved. For simplicity's sake, I will sketch three major conceptions of acting as if, all of which I think imply a different relation to prefiguration. Obviously, in 20 minutes, I cannot develop three ironclad theories of prefigurative politics. What I want to do is provide starting points for discussion and to assess the relevance of Rancière's work. So I would be really glad then in the end to hear how you think my presentation relates to your own work, and if you think you can make it productive or not. I mean, that is a legitimate conclusion. So before going into the details, I want to sketch the general presuppositions involving informing Rancière's text. Now, if you look into Rancière's text, you immediately realize that there's a prevalence of abstraction. This may lead one to conclude that Rancière is a political theorist. However, he never uses the term. Rather, Rancière himself repeatedly suggested that he does not attempt to provide a theory of politics, setting the principles for political practice. This may seem like an arbitrary assertion. Rancière, however, argues that the very concept of theory, as opposed to practice, which is in the title of the conference, rests upon metaphysical dichotomies: activity and passivity, knowing and experiencing, thinking and doing. Thus, to assume the position of a theorist, like to speak as a philosopher, as a social scientist, or even as an engaged intellectual, is to presuppose set dichotomies. According to Rancière, those conjectures cannot be circumvented by situating oneself on the side of practice either. To speak as a practitioner, as an activist, or as someone who's simply sharing experiences, may sketch a different relation between thinking and doing, but it nevertheless assumes that thinking and doing can be separated in the first place. Therefore, the very distinction of theory and practice is not universal, but needs to be put under scrutiny. To do this, Rancière develops a peculiar style of writing. And now I want to quote at length from a somewhat strange text. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint. So this is a text in which Rancière talks about his own methodology in the third person perspective. It's somewhat a strange text, but a very illuminating one. This is the main intuition underpinning Rancière's method. There is not, on the one hand, theory, which explains things, and on the other hand, practice educated by the lessons of theory. There are configurations of sense, knots tying together possible perceptions, interpretations, orientations, and movement. This is why, indeed, Rancière's concepts are unstable. Police and politics, distribution of the sensible, aesthetics, literature, etc., don't mean the same thing from the beginning of the travel to the end. This passage hopefully illustrates both the difficulty and the potential of utilizing Rancière for thinking about prefigurative politics. On the one hand, it seems difficult to integrate his arguments and concepts into a theory of performative politics without risking major inconsistencies. On the other hand, Rancière may be helpful to think about prefigurative politics by calling attention to the presuppositions involved and making it possible to consider alternatives. Again, I'm not here to convince you that you have to take those alternatives, but I do think it can be helpful to consider what options are there in the first place. So what does Rancière offer? In the passage I quoted, he suggests two things. On the one hand, all enunciations can be considered equal, insofar as they are performances of speaking beings about what it means to be a speaking being. So for Rancière, ultimately, there is no fundamental difference between a philosopher's treatise, a historian's narrative, a poet's verse, or a worker's tale. They are ways of making sense of the world one lives in and one's relation to it and to oneself. On the other hand, most enunciations do not accept this equality, but try to assert their own specificity. So to write a theory is, at least according to Rancière, to assume that one can say something that other modes of speaking cannot say. So the difficult task Rancière sets for himself is to invent a way of speaking that does not reaffirm this assertion of specificity. And thus the somewhat odd use of the metaphors in the passage I've just quoted. So this allows Rancière to treat workers like philosophers, philosophers like poets, and poets like economists. I'm bringing this up for two reasons. Firstly, I want to argue that Rancière's style of writing mirrors the demand of prefigurative politics. It enacts non-hierarchical relations on a small scale. This does not mean that it is prefigurative politics. Rather, as I will show later, he calls it metapolitics. But what it does mean is that on a very fundamental level, Rancière's thinking is informed by a shared trajectory, so to speak. Secondly, the creative character of his writing highlights the difficulty of extracting fixed concepts from it. Rancière is constantly reworking his concepts. Thus, rather than giving a list of different meanings of the term politics in his writing, I want to sketch the role of acting as if. If we consider the various functions of counterfactual behavior, we can sketch what he, or sketch, or at least figure out what he has to say about prefigurative politics. So, since his 1983 book, The Philosopher and His Poor, a common denominator in Rancière's text is that counterfactual modes of organization and social relationships that strive to reflect the future society are not necessarily emancipatory. Rancière addresses this indirectly via a reading of the Politeia. As you might know, the Politeia is Plato's attempt to conceive a society where everyone can act according to their needs and abilities. Rancière uses it as a paradigm through which he addresses Marxism, Bourdieu, and politics of art. The reason for this is that Plato argues that for people to be able to act according to their abilities, you need a way of conveying what those abilities are in the first place. So Plato suggests one should invent a narrative according to which people have different souls. Souls of iron, souls of silver, souls of gold. And here Rancière points out that, and here I quote again, obviously Plato does not demand that workers get the inner conviction that a deity truly mixed iron in their souls and gold in the soul of the rulers. It is enough that they sense it. That is, that they use their arms, their eyes, and their minds as if it were true. The ordering of social occupations works in the mode of this as if. Inequality works to the extent that one believes it, that one goes on using one's arms, eyes, and brains according to the distribution of positions. This is what consensus means. And this is the way domination works. Again, this passage is not about Plato. Rancière's description can be applied to my talk as well. To speak here, I must convey the ability to speak here, that I'm qualified to speak about Rancière more than other people. And I can say if you have the conviction that I am qualified to do so, but by listening, you are acting as if you are. As if I am, sorry. It could seem that this is not a hierarchical relation, that I'm, just sharing knowledge, that in fact we are prefiguring a non-hierarchical society by sharing our thoughts and ideas about stuff we spend a lot of time with. And honestly, that is the feeling I got when listening to some of your talks. So I'm not here to criticize. But the point I'm trying to make is that according to Rancière, one needs to develop criteria to distinguish hierarchical modes of acting counterfactually from emancipatory ones. It is significant that this talk seemed impossible for Rancière for a while. In 1987's The Ignorant Schoolmaster, he in fact argued that emancipation and any collective prefiguration of a free society are mutually exclusive. In this individualist view, prefigurative politics enacts a performative contradiction. It undermines what it tries to prefigure. In 1995, with the book called Disagreement, Rancière was able to do away with this view. And Anat has thankfully sketched the main argument in her presentation on Friday. Disagreement suggests that there are forms of collective emancipation insofar as they are an affirmation of a fundamental equality. Rancière calls those subjectivations politics. What distinguishes politics in the strict sense from other forms of community formation is that for Rancière, politics does not correspond to a group identity. And this is somewhat similar to what Maxim has mentioned before. So it's not a substantial identity, but something else. And again, I quote, neither the we or the identity assigned to it, nor the apposition of the two defines a subject. There are political subjects, or rather modes of subjectivations, only in the set of relationships that the we and its name maintain with the set of persons, the complete play of identities and alterities implicated in the demonstrations and the worlds, common or separate, where these are defined. So Rancière's favorite example for this is the slogan used by the 1968 protesters in Paris. We are all German Jews. Of course, the protesters didn't assume that there were Jewish people from Germany. They didn't replace their French identity with another identity, but rather engaged in what Rancière calls a disidentification, a refutation of an identity. Then politics in the Rancièrean sense does not oppose wrong ways of living with a real free community. But it is, and you find that quote on the PowerPoint again, it is a practice of the as-if that constitutes the subject's form of materializations, and it opens up an aesthetic community in Kantian fashion. This alludes to Kant's theory of the judgment of taste. So, for instance, if I were to say, this plant is beautiful, according to Kant, it would not imply that beauty is an objective quality of the plant, in as much as, you know, its size is an objective quality. Rather, again, according to Kant, one is talking about the plant as if everyone would have to reach the same conclusion. So if Rancière brings this analogy into his discourse, this suggests that the politicity of counterfactual behavior does not consist in how the behavior within the group anticipates a future society. Rather, its politicity is the prefiguration of a non-identitarian relation to what is outside the group, how like the group formation will be received by others. This aesthetic concept of subjectivation also raises the issue what modes of acting as if can be considered political in a strong sense. And this is where I think Rancière has revised his own position, because in the 1990s, he suggested that the play of identities and alterities proper to politics is not exclusive to politics, but can be traced in artworks as well. Rancière tries to show this in a fascinating readings of the poet Stéphane Mallarmé. Rancière sees Mallarmé as a historically inclined thinker who attempts to prefigure an egalitarian future society that engenders set play of identities and alterities. So in the text following this agreement, Mallarmé functions as Rancière's prime dialogue partner who enacts an artistic equivalent of politics. However, starting in the 2000s, Rancière has continuously moved on from this conception. Starting with 2004's Aesthetics and its Discontents, he argues that political subjectivation enacts a community formation, while an artwork is only to be able to anticipate a community formation. And here is the last quote of my presentation, which hopefully illustrates this. The aesthetics of politics, so you can read here subjectivation, consists above all in the framing of a we, a subject, a collective demonstration whose emergence is the element that disrupts the distribution of social parts. In the politics of aesthetics, you can read art, frames new forms of individuality and new hexeities. It does not give a collective voice to the anonymous. Instead, it reframes the world of common experience as the world of shared impersonal experience. Art, then, for Rancière, is not political in a strict sense, but what he calls metapolitical. Like politics, it is about constructing other forms of communal living, but it does so by other means. In the 1990s, Rancière thought of politics and aesthetics as supplementary. In the 2000s, this is superseded by an agonistic view in which prefigurative politics and aesthetic prefiguration both make each other possible, but also constantly threaten each other's identity. Art, then, for Rancière, can help us think about politics, but the relation between politics and art must constantly be renegotiated. For instance, Rancière is very skeptical of the claim that specific artworks support political movements as they risk effacing political subjectivations that they claim to support. I come to the end of this arguably tour de force. So what I try to do is to develop some markers where a discussion can follow, and like to help one estimate where Rancière might be interesting and where there might be problems. And so I would be very interested in hearing from you what you think about that, where you see the problems, where you might have a different reading of Rancière, and just how it relates to your own work. I'm also looking forward to discussing Qian and Maxim's paper. And I am going to be silent now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are now opening the floor for a discussion of all three papers, which were so interesting, and I think they play nicely with one another. So you can probably enjoy that fact as well. So just take a minute, arrange your thoughts, and if there are any questions, please raise your hand, either raise your hand or write them in the chat box, or just help yourself and unmute and share with us. Okay, I'll give you a second to regroup, and I will take the opportunity to ask some questions myself. I have actually somewhat between. Well, no, I you know what, I'm gonna. People are already ready to ask. So let's start with Divina, then Matthias, and
Thank you. Yeah, those were really interesting papers. And I had a question for Qian, which I really liked your paper. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the prefigurative dimension of nationality or national identity or nationhood as you saw it. Are these, I mean, I think I could see that you were talking about it through ideas about performativity and what gets problematized through how it's done. And I wondered if when you were talking at the end about repulsion, whether it was being repulsed by ourselves was how we would prefigure a kind of national identity through its disavowal. Is that where you're going with thinking about it in prefigurative terms, or were there other dimensions you didn't have time to talk about?
Thank you for your question. Sorry, I'm taking 2 seconds to collect my thoughts. Yeah, the prefigurative aspect of my paper, I think is, as you noted, probably not as developed conceptually. What I was gesturing to is the potential that the prefiguration entails. It opens up a lot of possibilities for us to imagine, but at the same time, as you know, the aspect that abjection brings out is that there are aspects of why the nation state is so durable, and that stops us from realizing these other potentialities. So I think my where I was more interested in is in trying to elucidate, I guess, the relationship between the metaphysical potentialities that national identity should hold, if and that performativity elucidates, but also why these figured perceptions of national identity are so stubborn, and also, so I think abjection, expulsion is one way to understand why national identity remains a force that's not really going away, but at the same time why we should question and harp more on the prefigurative. Yeah, that's one way I'll answer your question. The shorter answer would be that yeah, I only really have metaphysical comments about the prefigurative aspect of national identity, and those draw directly on how Judith Butler conceptualizes gender. I can only say that national identity is very fluid, but I don't really have anything concrete to add about that because I suppose it lies outside my imagination. I can't really figure it right now. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question satisfactorily.
Yeah, so that just made me think as where you were ending with the sort of some of her work in Gender Trouble on the hyperbolic performance of gender. And I was just thinking, I wonder if that is being taken up at all in terms of thinking if the hyperbolic performance of national identity, whether that's a way of undercutting its naturalism. Yeah,
I think that is one way to take it. Definitely one way I imagine it. For example, as a Singaporean, there's a lot of emphasis on how we are distinct from everyone else, National Day parades and speeches and rallies. I think these are all moments, like the big moments that Michael Billig talks about. But I also tried to underscore how in between these big moments or very obvious flashes of national identity, how it's maintained itself, how it reproduces itself all the time. And I think those are maybe spots, not really blind spots, but just spots that we might not really pay attention to, because national identity, when we do talk about it in a lot of the existing scholarship, is something like it's a force to be reckoned with, but a lot of its power comes from the quotidian. Yeah, so that's where I was trying to go with my paper.
Right.
Thanks for your question.
Matthias, will you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for all the exciting and interesting papers. I have a question specifically for Maxim. As the end of Maxim's paper also touched upon a subject that has that I've been thinking about a lot, which is indeed the problem of the means-ends equivalence, and the question whether that is at all sufficient to understand what prefiguration is about. Dan has written some great stuff on this. The question is also raised by Luke Yates, for instance, in his work. And to be honest, I'm more and more convinced indeed that the very means-ends distinction is not very helpful. But not only for theoretical reasons, but also for practical reasons. If we look at, in some cases, self-proclaimed prefigurative practices at the moment, one thing that they often seem to have in common is that it's far from clear what the ends exactly are. As a matter of fact, finding out what these ends might entail is precisely one of the purposes why one engages with prefigurative practice. And there's, I think, good practical explanations for that as well. We live in times when there is no ready-made program for radical change. There are no big ideological or strategic stories of how a revolution must be brought about or what a radically different society should look like. So arguably one of the reasons why people engage in this prefigurative experimentation is precisely because they don't know that. There's also another reason why the means-ends distinction may not be sufficient, and that's perhaps a very Arendtian argument, if you like. And that is that it appears to be the case that in prefigurative practices, one often seeks to sustain or to prolong prefigurative practices. The last thing one often wants is to see them coming to an end. So that's why I call it Arendtian, if we use the term end in the double sense of the word, both the temporal end and in the sense of an objective. It appears to be the case that in most prefigurative practices, the last thing one wants is to actually reach a point at which the conclusion can be drawn that, well, our prefigurative politics has reached its end, literally and figuratively. Now, so I think there's good reasons to question this means-ends distinction. But then what puzzles me is the relation with the promise, with the Derridian promise, as you presented it, precisely because it often is far from clear what the ends should be. Does it make sense at all to think of prefigurative politics as something that is informed by a more or less concrete promise or a more or less concrete idea of a society to come? Or should that, if we want to indeed get rid of this very means-ends distinction, may that not mean that we need to get rid of the very idea of ends and therefore also the idea of concrete promises that are at stake or that are waiting for us somewhere at the horizon? Obviously, there is still a future to be prefigured, but what this future might be, what it might characterize, what it might entail, perhaps that is precisely the question at stake in prefigurative practices. So to make it more concrete, I didn't quite follow the step from the critique of means-ends distinctions to a Derridian promise. I didn't see the concrete link there.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there's a number of points there. So I'll start with just the means-ends distinction in itself. So I think and that's something that definitely I could get sharper. There's a risk in talking about this means-ends distinction and talking about the blurring of the line between it, which the point of which I think is really to suggest that they're never, if I sort of restate your Arendtian point, there never really was such a strong distinction that is really categorical in politics between means and ends, but they're always intertwined. And of course, the risk is, if we want to speak of prefigurative politics in terms of blurring that distinction, that we nevertheless keep holding on to this distinction that we want to do away with. However, so one way to frame that is to say that regardless of the fact that there is no, which I do agree with, that there is no concrete predetermined end which the means must somehow reflect, I think it's fair to say, nevertheless, that all those engaged in political practices, whether prefigurative or not, do have some idea of why they're engaged in that. So they do have maybe not a set goal, but they clearly have their reasons to be doing so. Now, the link to the Derridian promise. So the way I read his idea of promise in conjunction with his notion of democracy to come is that the entire point of it is that the promise promises something for the future, but the democracy to come supplements that with the fact that it always remains to come. So it's a horizon that once you think you get there, there's a further horizon. So that sort of guarantees its future-oriented character without needing to determine this is the point at which we've reached the future we've been aiming for all along. Because the first point is, of course, and that relates back to this, the questionability of the means-ends distinction, whether that future is, whether we really know specifically what future that is. And the second is, of course, that, as Derrida himself argues, that if you would really want to go about sort of setting up such a project that has a determinate end goal in sight, that means that you'd have to know and have to determine what social relations would look like at such a point. That you could somehow come to a perfection of social relations. And then again, you get back to the point where that sort of configures modes of relationality in a sort of static being where they're unchanging. And that again rules out free action. So that's something definitely that, and that's something I would follow Derrida in, that he doesn't want to go to. So I think in that way, the blurring of the means-ends distinction to the extent that there is no clear end fits quite well with the promise of democracy to come, in the sense that it always remains to come, in the sense that there might be certain reasons why, instead of determined ends, why certain actors engage in different forms of politics, but those are not ends in the sense that they really come to an end.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm probably not familiar enough with Derrida in that sense, but I'd follow you on that. I just think it's very important to account for that aspect, for the experimental aspect, that the very content of the end is always rearticulated and always rethought and contested. And yeah, so that's but I don't know Derrida well enough to see if his account could cater to that. But I think precisely when it's about the means-ends distinction, that experimental characteristic of prefiguration, especially in its more recent iterations, is very important, I think. Yeah, thanks.
I would like to chip in on that right before I'll hand over to Dan. So I think this, I think that the notion of the to come, and given the answer you got from Maxim, I think it's important to remember that the notion of the to come is not focused on the future. It rather focuses on the present. It's the whole point in the Derrida's messianic structure is that he says about the Messiah, he's coming right now. It will always be to come, but it is a to come that is right now and should shape our present. So, and it is in light of a future which we know something about clearly, but obviously we cannot know it all, for otherwise we would have probably we would have been able to fulfill it right now, and we never could. We never can, because it's principally impossible. So it is this contradictory term that we can articulate to a certain extent, that is supposedly shaping our future here and now by striving for it, although we know we can never reach it. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. And Dan, your question, floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for all three papers. I thought really enjoyed them, and I thought they went together really well. I think my question is mostly for Michael, though I think it might raise questions for others as well. And if I understood you right, I took you to be sort of saying I think something very useful, which goes to the heart of, in a way, the theme of the conference, which is that whereas when we talk about prefiguration, we tend to obviously be talking about temporality. It's there in the word, right? In the pre, it seems obvious we're anticipating something in the future. Acting as if can be a much doesn't have to be acting as if a future goal. Acting as if can be in many different ways. So I suppose my question is partly like, is that what you were saying? And if so, I think it's a really useful point. And what I find a little bit difficult is how we think about acting as if, or how we can think about the kind of the clearly emancipatory possibilities of this acting as if it's not about a desired future. And I suppose I'm interested if you had more to say about that. I wanted to. No, I'll just leave it there. I had a thought about what we were just discussing about ends, but I think no, actually I will say it because I just remembered what it is, which is I almost wanted to ask a question in kind of the opposite direction, because as Matthias mentioned, I mean, I firmly agree about the importance of the importance of experimentation, the importance of ends to the extent they exist at all being emergent and subject to revision and so on. But I think one of the things I feel, and maybe this is just my kind of, the two souls of my thinking coming out. One of the things I often feel actually with all three thinkers that we've talked about, Derrida, Butler, and Rancière, is I worry sometimes about the lack of the inability to fully attend to what you might call like revolution, like a certain kind of moment of big ruptural change or of abolition of something. And so I often worry that we when we talk about, for example, abolition of we talked about abolition of gender, we could talk about abolition of capital, right, of these kinds of things, where they seem to be kind of very concrete moments where we want to say, actually, there's something to transcend right now, rather than a kind of ongoing negotiation of difference. And because I have the three of you here, I'm really interested in your thoughts about that question, because it's something I often find myself running up against. And maybe it's based on my ignorance of the texts, but I'd be really interested in the question, or in your answers rather.
If some of you guys want to start, you're welcome to. If not, the first issue you raised with acting as if and relation to prefigurative or temporal politics, yes, that is my point, or was my point, that I would argue that we have to separate those, and we have to also see what kind of temporal relations are sketched. In regards to equality, thank you for the question. I think that is something we might have to discuss, because I think Anat and I are taking very different positions here. In my reading, Rancière is very skeptical of seeing equality as a state which has to be achieved in the future, because he suggests that if we do that, we are already suggesting an inequality. So saying we are not equal yet, then you are also saying, according to Rancière at least, there are two kinds of people. One kind of people who don't know that we are not equal, and the people who know that we are not equal. So again, this is the kind of performative contradiction that for him, in my reading at least, to say equality is something that has to be achieved undermines that very equality. So for him, like emancipation is something that is to be achieved in the present. And what is prefigured then I would think is, again, not as much the state of equality, but rather how other people relate to that equality. And again, this is something which you can discuss, and Anat, you're free to disagree with me. And this brings me to the last issue that you raised, the question of revolution, which is, I think, very important. And if I understood you correctly, you're not talking about assessing revolution from a historical perspective. So it's not about, you want to know what the French Revolution was. It's about how do we get to a point of revolution? And to some extent, like, I have to agree with you that Rancière's view on this might be insufficient in the sense that he doesn't really have a theory of organizations. And this is something he has admitted, that like he's interested in it, but he himself wasn't able to fully develop a theory of organizations. The reason for that is that, like, he tends to be very skeptical of it, and very skeptical of the vanguardism, which he also discussed in yesterday in the panel. He's also skeptical of the opposite of what's like associated with Maoism, of saying like the people are always right. But there is something that's missing, so to speak, in his theory. And now I would be very interested in hearing what Maxim and Qian have to say about that. Maybe you have an alternative.
Maxim, do you want to go first?
I can go. Yeah, whatever you prefer. You can go first as well if you want to.
I think you can go first. Yeah, I think my point's a bit quite different from Michael's. Yeah. So. Okay.
So I'll first just briefly go back to Anat, because I think that's a really important sort of a nuance or addition of my point. You mentioned this messianic structure. So it's true that this to come attests to a certain degree of futurity, but one that should never, it shouldn't induce us to wait for it to come, but it also should induce us to act in the here and now. In that sense, I do think it's prefigurative to the extent that it attests to a certain future that always does remain to come, but that is always brought into the present as a sort of a call for action, if you want to call it that. Now, as for Dan's point, I think I agree with most of what Michael already said. I think I could add that it's true that maybe we don't, maybe this doesn't offer really the tools to think of revolutionary moments. But I think it's also, so this is a critique that's often been leveled at theories of constituent power, for example, that they oversimplify the process of constitutional creation by reducing it to a moment of decision. And I think to some extent that critique is justified. Also, no matter what you want to characterize a revolutionary moment as, if you think about those, they rarely, if ever, come out of the blue, right? There's always been a process of negotiation, contestation, agitation, preceding any such outburst of revolutionary energy. And it usually doesn't stop there, because now the situation might have fundamentally changed. But then the question remains, where do we go from here? So I would say that it might be true that at least what I've been doing puts And I think that's also true for someone like Ancière, as Michael pointed out, puts more emphasis on the sort of smaller incremental moments of change. But my worry is also, and I guess that's part of what motivates me there, is that the emphasis that tends to be put on sort of revolutionary outbursts or singular moments tends to blur out the very important continuous processes of negotiation that precede and follow any such moments.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, for your question. So if I understand your question correctly, it's I guess a worry about the inability to fully attempt revolution, a lack of clarity of being able to see the concrete moment of this is it, and then we'll make some changes. I'm not qualified to say what Butler thinks about this, but I can give like a Butler-esque response or what I take from her. I think how I've chosen to, or how I like to read Butler is that if there is to be change, and there will be change, but if we are going to have like intentional change, it's probably going to be incremental, because how constructs like gender come about is from it sediments over time, but even while it is also heavily regulated. And so, I mean, I think Butler is also often criticized for, I guess, what Michael was saying about how Rancière doesn't have a theory of organization. I think she's often criticized for being too abstract. She also doesn't have a theory of organization. And in that sense, not too much of a direction of where do we go from here besides some gestures towards equality. But one of the many ways that I find Butler quite fruitful for thinking about why, and sometimes the direction of where we should head towards, is in terms of considering also why constructs like gender are so stubborn. So like what Davina was talking about, how the hyperbolic displays of gender, they simultaneously are in the front to foundationalist conceptions of gender, while also resedimenting these very constructs of gender. And so personally, I think, and I agree with Maxim on how change will probably be taken in smaller steps, in incremental units, and that probably we could try to apply big concepts that people like Butler give to us and apply it to specific cases. For example, in considering the difference between an alienated citizen who has to stay in wherever they are versus the economic migrant who can act on these changes and challenge the national identity in different ways. So yeah, I think my take from a Butler perspective is that we probably won't be able to get to revolution, but we can get some change.
Yeah, I see. I see that Michael has a question. Is it okay if I ask my questions and then you will like join? Okay, who is your question for? Who is the question for? What discussion would you like to?
It's mainly a question for Qian, but it relates to Maxim as well. But it's different things. So please go ahead and start.
Let's try to make it all together, and then we'll finish with this round. Okay, so I have actually it is somewhere between comments and questions to all three of you, all three presenters, and I think Qian, you were your entire presentation was focused around around a notion that I kept asking myself, why would she go specifically to this notion instead of something else, which is more flexible, more dynamic ways of thinking about state and population, because once you're speaking about the nation and the national identity, and using thinkers like Butler, whose whole point pretty much is the non-binary binary and the diversity and the range, then I think maybe your aim should be to not to make the notion of national identity more flexible, but rather maybe perhaps to get rid of the national identity and replace it with either society or community or ideas that are like intuitively more dynamic or more flexible and enable more change. So this is just like a thought. And I was wondering, listening to Maxim, problematizing the ontology element or realm of the people. First, I was, it sent me straight back to Rousseau, to this famous moment in The Social Contract, in which he says the act by which a people is a people. So it's not something that is assumed to begin with, but rather, he at the very least, Rousseau is pretty much convinced that he can point out the moment where this where this entity is created, and of course, it has all sorts of problems later on. But this is this moment. But then I thought perhaps instead of thinking about it in the Derridian terms of the to come, or maybe in addition to think about it in the Derridian terms of the to come, this problematic ontological entity that exists or does not exist, you might want to go there to the notion of the supreme fiction. Simon Critchley reads this, makes wonders with this notion of Wallace Stevens. It appears in Wallace Stevens, and Critchley takes this political turn on it, and the notion of the supreme fiction, which is a fiction which we know to be a fiction yet choose to believe, and for him it's very, and I think it could be proven useful to your discussion. And finally, Michael, I just I think that we agree much more than you think we do, but I was what struck me is something that you kind of went through too quickly, was the distinction between art and aesthetics, because you were speaking about Rancière when you were talking about the politics of aesthetic and aesthetic of politics, which is of course also related to discussions of political art, but the whole term of aesthetic that comes that serves like in the distribution of the sensible in Italy, and the notion that the political and the aesthetic are so strongly intertwined and cannot be separated, goes to the aesthetic in the aesthesis, in the whole like perceptual, and it's not just limited to art. And I think this might be some of what you think, in which we differ, but I'm not really sure. So if you want to quickly have your responses.
Does Michael want to ask his question first?
it's up to you. So it's mainly a question for you. So maybe you don't want to answer two questions at the same time.
Oh, I think you can. Yeah, we can hear it first.
Okay. So if I'm not mistaken, the title of your talk was referring to Judith Butler's notes towards a performative theory of the assembly. And so I was a bit surprised to hear you emphasizing gender trouble so much. And there's, which is good, it's a great book. There's just one thing I was wondering, and I would be glad if you could help me with that. If I understood you correctly, you were in relation to nationalism, emphasizing the abjections and exclusions of an outside. So as someone like who's not part of the nation. And if I remember it correctly, in the Notes Towards a Performative Theory of the Assembly, Butler also suggests that a state society also sort of does away with the people that constitute it. So her term for this is that there is an anarchist interval or permanent principle of revolution that resides within democratic orders, in the sense that the legitimacy of a state is always grounded by actions of popular sovereignty, of the assembly, etc. And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the how do you think the actions and assemblies and stuff like that that constitute nationalism are dealt with from the perspective of a constituted national identity?
Yeah, thank you both for your questions. So I'll try to respond to both of your comments and follow-up question. So I think, yeah, Anna, you are absolutely right that I think the next step or the implications of what I've been trying to say, arguing for a more flexible understanding of national identity would be to consider notions of society and community. I think that is a very helpful next step. And I guess one problem or one reason why I still come back personally to ideas about nations is that this more rigid notion of national identity, I think it still remains, at least insofar as it has this inextricable relation to the nation state and citizenship. And so I think what applying Butler to theories of nationalism helps us see is that a performative national identity is not so different from what we generally refer to as society and community. And I definitely did not cover the theoretical basis of what a society and community is, but from what I know so far, it feels like even sociology cannot really agree on a definition of society. I mean, that doesn't excuse me from not considering theories of society. But yeah, I think that's a next step. And going into that will require, I think, a lot more considerations of what we typically consider constitute society, like the economy, the law, science, medicine, technology. And yeah, I think that would be probably a next step. Yeah, I guess the puzzle or a better way to frame my paper might have been to consider why, even though we have made a lot of headway into thinking about national identity more flexibly, especially people who have put in a lot of time into thinking about this subject. We almost always agree that it is actually a very flexible notion and that the nation-state dichotomy is always tenuous. But given these headways, what we see today in our world, I think is a reality that still harks back a lot to the nation-state. So I find that very, I think it's a puzzle that I still think about, and I think it at least part of the answer would lie in how the nation-state is still a pretty important way that resources are distributed and allocated. Yeah, and then on to Michael's comment about Butler's work on performative theory of assembly. I have to say I am less familiar with that. It's been a while, but I do see I do understand my applications of performativity to national identity as saying something similar to what Butler talks about in a performative theory of assembly, and why I still choose to employ lenses from the theoretical framework she established in gender theory is because I think that what she says in her theory of assembly boils down to how, I guess, identity is constituted through time, through multiple acts that still differ from what should be. I think she has her own ideas about what a democracy should be, but I guess because of where I happen to have spent a lot of my years living, I spent a lot of time in Singapore. The idea of democracy was never really at the forefront in conceptions of the nation state. Yeah, I think a lot of politicians, a lot of political scientists classify, for example, Singapore as a benevolent authoritarian state, and so I decided to go for what I see as a theoretical pre-step, a step that comes before her ideas of assembly and democracy, and just try and understand why national identity remains something, remains a notion that is so powerful and exclusionary, even though if we sit ourselves down, we can all agree that it is something that is much more flexible and dynamic. Yeah, so that's, and as for the title, I was trying to be punny, but I see that it is misleading. Yeah, thank you for your comments. Okay, let me know if you have follow-up questions.
We are just to let you know that we are 10 minutes over time, which is a panel that was timed according to 4 speakers. So I would like to give Michael and Maxim a chance to respond, but please, if you can do it, just like briefly and shortly, and then we'll all say goodbye for a little while till we meet again.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'll be very brief. So I think it's funny that you bring up Rousseau, because in an earlier version of this talk that was about twice the length of this version, there was a part about Rousseau, which I took out just for reasons of time. And that's actually one of the places where I got this idea for the seeing constituent power as the articulation of a claim. And that kind of comes through Bonnie Honig's reading of Rousseau's figure of the legislator, which I tend to interpret as, so she thinks that's sort of the constitutive paradox of politics, right? And what Honig basically argues is that Rousseau actually doesn't reproduce the same problem by introducing the legislator, but kind of shifts it to a different level. And the way I interpret that is that basically a legislator, which in that figure is an external figure, makes a claim to offer good law to a group of people who are not yet a people. And the very fact that that forces a choice to either accept or reject that sort of propels them into a form of collective willing. And then you get a sort of praxis-based creation of such an entity that is not grounded in a pre-existing ontological basis, but that comes forward from the way it acts and whether or not it accepts or rejects such a proposal. Then I kind of want to reform that and to say, well, it doesn't have to be an external, or rather it shouldn't be an external figure, but it can be a claim coming from the inside. And second, I'll be very brief about that. So I was not really familiar with this notion of supreme fiction, but it does sound like it's quite relevant to what I'm doing here. So yeah, thanks for that suggestion, and I'll look into it.
Thank you for your question. I try to be brief too, but just so as a general remark, if someone wants to leave, it's fine with me. I'm not taking it personally. So I think you're absolutely right that in Rancière, aesthetic has a very basic meaning in the sense of aesthesis, of perception, which you mentioned. And I probably should have gone more into that, or made it clearer, or at least my talk might have profited from it. I have, in fact, deleted those passages because, in my opinion, aesthetics is one of the messiest terms in Rancière that assumes a lot of different meanings. You can see that in the last quote I had in my presentation. So aesthetics here already has two different meanings. In the aesthetics of politics, it's the aesthetic, the perceptual sense that you mentioned. In the politics of aesthetics, it means a very specific historical formation of the 18th century, which corresponds to, Rancière argues that that art as a phenomenon in the singular, not as arts, but as in the singular, arose. And I, wanted to gloss over those differences to not complicate it more, but maybe that did in fact complicate it more. So I'm thankful for your suggestion.
So thank you. So basically, I just reacted to the larger versions of your papers with all the what was edited out. So that's perfect. That means it still resonates. Okay, so thank you very much for this. Really, I enjoyed your papers so much, and I think it was an excellent panel. So thank you all, and thank you for everyone who participated in the discussion. And we will meet again. We will meet again actually in half an hour at 3 for our next exciting panel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for this beautiful conference.